So, with the recent release of Star Fox Zero for the Wii U, I've become interested in revisiting this series. I have a good amount of history with it, starting out with the Star Fox Assault for the Nintendo GameCube, and then sort of exploring the rest at random, including Lylat Wars, the European name for Star Fox 64, and Star Fox Command for the Nintendo DS. However, since my last elementary school year in 2007, I had never really touched any of the games again until summer of 2014, when I fully beat the SNES original for a review. Very little came of the scripts and work I did that year though. I wasn't quite comfortable and dedicated yet, but now that it's a small 2 years later with this current channel up and running, it was almost nostalgic in a sense for me to recomplete the game, and it's going to be a cool experience for me contrasting this script you're going to hear in this video to what I had written back then. Personal banter aside, Star Fox, or Star Wing as it's called in Europe, is mostly known for its 3D graphical prowess done on the 60-bit Super Nintendo with the assistance of the Super FX chip, a coprocessor located inside the cartridge that was engineered by Argonaut software. In 1993, there weren't a whole lot of video games that boasted filled three-dimensional polygons, and from what I've gathered, it was impressive to witness the visuals and depth brought forth by Star Fox, to say the least. It provided a sneak peek at what the future of gaming could be holding in store. Additionally, the fact it pulled in high scores from review and media outlets, and continues to do so with articles that reflect on it in retrospect, would lead one to believe Star Fox was more than just a glorified tech demo. If you want to hear me break the game down into an analysis of that and its overall quality and design, then stay tuned. Flicking the power switch immediately boots us into a short opening sequence where we see a large space armada and a swarm of smaller ships approaching and attacking the blue planet Corneria. Coupled with the fact that you're the anthropomorphic Fox McCloud and need to travel from Corneria to another planet by the name of Venom, that's all the context you're given by the actual game. The manual reveals a lot more backstory on how this conflict between the two forces of Corneria and Venom had come to be. It's about some evil monkey scientist Andros who seeks revenge and wants to take over the Lylat system, but see, the manual, who wants to read plain text when it's concerning a goddamn video game, mate? I know it was common for games to lack strong storytelling, but considering Ninja Gaiden on the NES had cinematic cutscenes combined with detailed dialogue throughout the course of the full adventure in 1989, I don't see why Star Fox couldn't do remotely the same. Perhaps it wasn't Nintendo's intent to drive the game by a plot though, so who's gonna sweat it, right? At least the setting and tone are epic and mysterious, and the soundtrack is an important contributor to that. The music playing over the intro is ominous, setting the mood perfectly, and the orchestral notes that immediately hit players at the title screen convey a sense of energy that pumps them up. This is soon followed up by the iconic Corneria theme with its heavy guitar chords and powerful low end. It's badass and a great piece to kick off the mayhem with. Much of the rest of the score continues to impress with orchestral sounds and compositions that encompass the other hectic nature of space combat and more laid-back, catchy melodies for stages such as Macbeth and Titania that fall more in line with the environment itself rather than the action. A lot of it does seem to be interchangeable, in part due to the primitive 3D graphics not waterfalling with detail, and not every track is as exciting or memorable as the other. For example, I find the one for Sector X very underwhelming because it lacks impact and it feels repetitive with little progression to it. And whatever plays in Sector Y sounds really down and melancholy for reasons I couldn't guess. The soundtrack of Star Fox is also one of those that arranges and remixes the central theme into a seizable portion of the music, which I could do without in the case of arcade games like this one, but it's not close to as frequently as in Monster World 4 for the Mega Drive, so I can manage. I'm sure it was entirely intentional as well, not a sign of laziness, because there is a wide array of boss music present, not just one repeated theme, which is an extra bit of effort that shines through. Anyway, Star Fox on the whole boasts a good collection of songs, and even though it might not be my favorite on the console, I respect what the musicians have added to the experience here. So, as you've no doubt been able to tell, Star Fox is an on-rail shooter, basically the 3D equivalent to side-scrolling shoot-em-ups in the veins of Thunder Force and Gradius. The objective is very simple: blow up everything in sight, dodge enemy attacks and obstacles, and face off against the boss by the end of the stage. One of my favorite aspects of this game that I immediately want to address is the pathway system. While most arcade-styled games are comprised of one linear set of levels with a replay value provided through a difficulty selection that affects variables like enemy AI, damage output, etc., Nintendo went with 3 different routes, courses, or whatever you want to call them. Levels is the term used in-game, that each have you traversing through a handful of different stages, with the exceptions of Canaria and Venom, your starting and ending points respectively. What's clever about this is that the routes simultaneously offer varying degrees of challenge. Number 1 is the easiest, number 2 is the in-between, and number 3 is the hardest. The benefit to this should speak for itself. The experience remains fresh with new locales, level designs, and bosses every time you're up for a bigger challenge, and say one is to revisit the game, he or she still has an incentive to go through the first and second courses. Whenever I pop in a Thunder Force title, I'm not even touching the easier difficulty options any longer. While I ended up criticizing Shadow the Hedgehog for a similar progression concept, there is very little justification to do the same for Star Fox. For one, beating Edgy the Hedgie requires you to go through a stop list a grand total of 10 times instead of 3, and secondly, the level designs are altered in Star Fox for Canaria and Venom for all the courses. Hell, Canaria changes its color scheme and has a new boss for Route 3, and Route 2's Venom sees the player soaring through a different place of the planet altogether. Sometimes bosses are reused between courses, which is admittedly a bit of a bummer, but it doesn't happen nearly enough to really harp on it. In terms of gameplay recycling and repetition, there isn't too much of that here. It's important that all the stages in the game are spread across 3 different routes though, as that way the developers could get away with forcing players to restart from scratch upon running out of continues. After all, a single playthrough is only 30 minutes to an hour long. If that time were to get tripled, then limited continues would be atrocious. One full playthrough with all the stages would work better with unlimited continues, and though gems like Gunstar Heroes using that design have proven that they can still be very challenging with the big adrenaline rushes, there is nothing quite like the intensity when you're on your very last life, especially at the final boss, with the fear in you of potentially going way back to square one soon, and if you do, having to order yourself a new controller and TV. Assuming equally well executed, both limited and unlimited continues have their subjective pros and cons, which I personally feel is a bit outside the scope of a review for one game to dive into, but I can totally understand Nintendo's decision to go with limited continues for Star Fox. They already had a bunch of first-party releases that adopted the home console philosophy like Super Mario World, Super Metroid, and The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. So wanting a highly stylized arcade-style experience to compete with comparable titles on the Mega Drive makes sense. Though I personally prefer unlimited continues and having each individual section of a game being harder to compensate. The key reason for limited continues not being an issue in Star Star Fox with me is that it doesn't employ the cheap or questionable tactics used by heaps of arcade titles to actively prevent players from winning. Most of the time, but I get ahead of myself. Running out of health usually boils down to the player not being skilled enough to survive. Furthermore, the game is pretty damn lenient with various energy replenishing rings, and the fact you even have a health bar in the first place makes a seizable difference. In games like Contra, everything insta-murders you, but in Star Fox, you can take many a hit before you're dead. Not only does this allow for damage dynamics between various enemy attacks, or collision with your surroundings for that matter, it also forms a safety net during the occasion something unfair does happen. Whether it's pop up in the environment with a debatably too strict time frame to dodge, or a boss with an unpredictable trick up his sleeve that takes you by surprise, at least Star Fox gives you a chance to possibly regain that lost health or accustom to a poorly thought out boss attack and still come out victorious. Unlike Contra and many other arcade games as well, Star Fox sends you back to the last activated checkpoint upon death, assuming you weren't on your last life, rather than respawning the Arwing where it got shot down. Now, this hasn't got much to do with fairness per se, but I like the checkpoint system here because if the game continued with the player merely losing a life and nothing else, I feel that would have detracted from the point of the boss battles of learning their attacks and patterns. Granted, the player is already discouraged to brute force his or her way through bosses due to the limited lives and continues, but beating them should always carry a sense of accomplishment via this method. Not that the system used in something like Streets of Rage lacks its own merits, but one can pass the hardest bosses there without actually doing well at all, seeing how fights do not reset when you lose a life. Looking at you, evil green twins. As for the frequency and placement of the checkpoints in Star Fox, there's usually one or two per stage, spaced apart accordingly. Most of the time, there isn't one before a boss fight, meaning that often the challenge comes from both reaching the encounter with enough health and then taking it down successfully with whatever you have left. This actually works well, as players should be decently familiar with the stage itself by then, and they are usually given a chance to amass a small number of upgrades and items, and or even a 1-up every time they are on their way to the boss again, possibly increasing their potential of winning. By default, the Arwing comes equipped with all the standard offensive fluff, a regular infinite ammo blaster, and a supply of bombs that act as screen nukes. Cool thing is, the blaster can actually be upgraded for more power up to 2 times, and extra bombs can be stocked up to a maximum of 5, and both of them affect the gameplay in a unique way. Breaking one of your wings or dying outright will revert your shots to their weakest form, which rewards great playing skills with that extra damage output when players manage to hold on to their blaster upgrades, yet at the same time doesn't really put those less proficient at the game in an impossible position. Every part of Star Fox is beatable with the standard blaster, as far as I could tell. I do think it would have made more sense for 1 destroyed wing to equate to 1 upgrade lost, not 2, which is how it currently is in the game, so that only the moment you go wingless on both sides or lose a life altogether, you're back to basics. Now, the bombs are a neat idea as well, not for the same reason as the blaster upgrades, but instead because they add a bit of dilemma to the mix. Do I draw bombs whenever the current situation turns a little too intimate and cozy in the stage itself, or do I save them to unleash carnage upon the boss at the end? Heck, you could even decide to refrain from using them until the much later stages. Sadly, the bombs aren't as tightly implemented in practice in my opinion. The game is too generous with granting you 3 bombs every time you die. None at all, or otherwise a single one maximum would have been better. 3 kind of undermines that aspect of decision making and is too easy to abuse, I think. Lastly, there's also a power-up that reduces the damage the Arwing receives, and this appears after 3 hits. However, its function doesn't really do much in the grand scheme of things. Occasionally, fancy shit like this is out in the open for you to snatch, but it's otherwise all obtained through different tasks. Whether it's reacting quickly enough to upcoming events, properly dodging obstacles in your line of flight, soaring through a set of gates without missing one that makes something appear, being forced to choose between 2 items at a whim, there's often some clever stuff going on in the stage design that makes collecting more interesting. The developers put in a good deal of secrets that the player can discover more and more of upon on multiple playthroughs of stages, like the giant space whale. Okay, in Sector Y that leaves behind an orgasm of goodies when you hit all the little stingrays prior to the boss encounter. The power-ups and things aren't just nice to have, but you have to earn them, and it's satisfying when you do. It's one of the reasons why the stages in Star Fox are fun to tackle. Another is that there is actually a good variety in the types of enemies to fight and obstacles to maneuver around. You've got your regular foes that really just fly around, attack you in different ways, and can be killed off without giving them a second thought, but then there's ones with specific weak spots, ones that make a last effort attempt to annihilate you, ones that demand you to hit the brakes to create proper distance. I guess what I'm trying to say is that carelessly shooting around without taking the effects that has into consideration isn't necessarily the ideal strategy to survive. The obstacles, whenever they happen to be there, are also quite interesting. You'll have to anticipate on the ones that move around in order to safely pass them, learn to tilt your ship sideways to slip through tight areas, and be quick to continue steering overall when necessary. Especially when bad guys and obstacles mix together, situations can turn into intensive multitask events, though that really doesn't happen frequently. The first course especially feels tame in this department, which only makes sense obviously, but it's the most boring as a result, and thus I vastly prefer the other two courses. That being said, what the hell is up with the timing on those closing and opening gates? I've always found dealing with them a bit of a pain in the ass, and I've never been able to nail down exactly when to hit the brakes or when to boost ahead. Don't quote me on this, perhaps it's just me, but the doors just seem to open or close whenever they feel like. My biggest beef with regards to questionable design, however, relates to an enemy known as the Big Stingray in Section Y on level 2. Shooting at it will trigger the bastard to hunt you down, and if you fail to dodge this attack, you lose about half of your energy. I was doing mighty fine on level 2 as I'd hardly died yet, but then lost about 4 lives to the Big Stingray and had to restart the playthrough. Again, maybe I was just being dumb for not understanding that he comes at you when you hit it enough times, but I think they could have made it more manageable to get out of the way when it does indeed assault you. That way, if players do not realize the trick, like me, it's more of an extra annoyance they keep putting themselves up with instead of a brick wall they'd be hard-pressed to outlast. If continues weren't limited in Star Fox, my points here would have been much weaker, but since, you know, they actually are limited, I personally feel hitting the Big Stingray should not have been as punishing as it is. Thankfully, most of the bosses in Star Fox are more intuitive from my experience. Avoiding crashes with contraptions that move toward you usually feels forgiving with build-up animations to them that should ring a bell on what you are supposed to do, and there is usually enough space to breathe. Anyway, naturally I think boss fights are most people's favorite parts of games like this, and I'd be right there with them here. None of the encounters feel much alike. Most of them have their own unique methods of trying to annihilate Fox, and they tend to have different defense mechanisms and processes of getting to their weak spots. One may require the player to shoot down 3 larks in quick succession in a rotating room to open up the core for a brief moment. The other may have a rotating part over the fuck me spots that returns the shots you send its way, and the next may duplicate itself threefold for you to focus on the real version. There is usually incoming energy balls, missiles, or fire or whatever continuously too, so that you're always kept on your toes and forced to focus on not just shooting, but surviving the ride as well. There is a level of strategy and observation involved when facing bosses that challenges within the stages simply do not provide, even though this element feels more muted when you have your blaster fully upgraded or a stack of bombs ready. Unfortunately, there are a couple of fights that aren't as exciting or well designed as the others. The Great Commander has you doing nothing more than repeatedly flying towards this humongous ship and trying to shoot down its 6 targets, with the difficulty arising solely from depth perception issues, and whenever bosses require you to hit the brakes to stay clear from them, it can be incredibly unpredictable what they're planning to do next. This dumps you into an awkward predicament where you don't know where to go anymore and could lose a huge chunk of energy in the process. It's kinda grating and frustrating. Monarch Dodora has this problem and additionally sports a giant sweeping tail that tends to fall off screen. As such, you'll lose track of where the tail is, giving it tons of opportunities to blindside you out of nowhere. I'm also not a fan of these wankers entering from behind for very obvious reasons, and it's not like they always do so from the same side of the screen either. Relatively speaking, most bosses are fine, with the less polished ones being in the minority. But together with issues a la Big Stingray, it's why I chose my words carefully earlier. The game doesn't employ cheap or questionable tactics most of the time. Mercifully, none of the bosses are that tough, which complements the limited continues and the rebooting to checkpoints when exploding into tiny little particles. Now, as an arcade-like title, Star Fox grants its continues through points with the maximum amount given by the end of a stage being 10,000. One continue is received when the player accumulates a score of 10,000, 30,000, and 50,000, which seems fine on the surface level, but ultimately isn't as dynamic as it could have been. Across 2 playthroughs of all 3 routes, 8100 is the absolute lowest I got on any stage, which multiplied by 5 stages would still roll out 40,500 points. However, having that provides no benefit whatsoever over scoring 6,000 across 5 stages, which adds up to 30,000 points. Taking into account, one would have to actively prevent themselves from racking up a lower total than 30,000 across 5 stages. My main issue here is that 2 continues are pretty much a given for any regular player. Not to say that this has a detrimental impact on the experience, mind you, but I would have liked a different concept for earning continues with more depth. As is, the score system is largely just an excuse for folks to feel superior in life based on a video game, and act like an annoying dick or dickina when they hold the record amongst friends and family. Admittedly essential for an arcade game, the team gimmick of Star Fox is equally as shallow and doesn't have any noteworthy impact on the gameplay. During your adventure, you're accompanied by your teammates Slippy Toad, Peppy Hair, and ungrateful twat Lombardi. I appreciate how it injects a bit of character into the experience, but their significance fails to extend beyond getting chased by a bad guy and you having to save their clumsy asses all the time, or them shooting down one single enemy once in a blue moon by comparison. Oh yeah, they give the rare piece of advice too. Hooray! Yay! Your colleagues do not offer real backup to reduce your workload in the slightest, so again, this is a bragging rights element. If you fail to save one of your friends, he will be missing in the final scene after destroying Andros. No more, no less, though I like how understated it is in the scene itself. The absence of one of the ships is so minor, yet it's a nagging, cold, hard reminder to players that they failed to pull the full team through all the hardships, that one of the members is outright dead. The guilt caught up to me to a degree that I didn't even feel victorious and contemplated a retry. This is proof that you do not need dramatic touches or sexy graphics to evoke the desired feels. With everything I've stated so far, it would be a safe bet to say I really don't have any major concerns about Star Fox, and you'd be correct, design-wise at least. I'm afraid I'll get flagged for this, but the biggest thing for me, and likely others as well, is the Super FX prospect itself. Let's start with the frame rate. I suspect it normally hovers around the 15 to 20 FPS area, which is fine enough, but whenever lots of polygons come on screen, it feels as if it dips well into single-digit territory, with drastic slowdown and input lag that stem from it. The developers mercifully adjusted the gameplay accordingly as much as possible. For example, the hordes of blocks Gray Monkey Face spits out toward you cause massive slowdown, but in that they move at a good velocity that gives you enough time to dodge properly, even though the motion and controls are jerky and delayed. Over time, you get accustomed to the low and inconsistent frame rate, and it's honestly impressive that the game is completely playable and beatable with its bad performance. But without a doubt, it's going to be severely distracting and alienating initially for newcomers. The polygonal nature of the graphics with the lack of textures and shadows can also leave you guessing about the positioning of the Arwing relative to the environment. I recall plenty of instances where I had trouble anticipating if I was going to collide with something or not. At points, I appeared to clip through a wall due to the angle, even though I didn't in actuality, and landing your shots can be trickier than it should. The Great Commander says hi for that, but this was the most apparent for me when trying to hit the floating triangles 3 times for a 1-up. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for it that lives aren't just given away and that you have to work for them, but when I screw up when I feel it wasn't even my fault, that's not very pleasing. This problem of disorientation came through the worst with wireframe objects. Wireframes were used because they're less taxing on the processor, but these do not do the best job illustrating to the player where they can go or not. Look at this jumbled mess right here. Where are the safe spots? This bit whizzed by way too fast for me to process and handle it properly. Once more, the developers realized to use wireframe obstacles in high moderation, so kudos to them for doing so. And when you get a decent feel for the game, the positioning jank mitigates a lot, but it compounds upon the frame rate and slowdown. The graphics, despite being strangely charming on one hand, are also painfully outdated on the other hand. While more advanced than hella impressive back then, primitive polygons haven't aged remotely as gracefully as pixel art, and they only leave so much room for artistic qualities to shine through. All the 2D assets, in contrast, hold up and make up the visual highlights with decently detailed backgrounds, weather effects, and scaling. Quirks such as the pilots of obliterated enemy ships flying towards you are original and funny, and even a handful of the 3D enemies have surprisingly stylized animations to them. I also gotta give credit to the fact that even though the game features sci-fi settings and vibes, not everything takes place in space. There's a selection of planets to see too, with different color schemes, and not even the set pieces between the space stages are much the same. All in all, I can only begin to imagine how the graphics were out of this dimension in the days of heated SNES versus Genesis debates. But regardless, I really couldn't blame people if they find them and the frame rate too hard to stomach now. When I say right now that Star Fox has fallen victim to the flaw of time, I genuinely do not mean anything harsh by that. I enjoy it way more than I originally expected before my first crack at it in 2014. And I can tell Argonaut Software and Nintendo did everything in their power to work around the inherent flaws and limitations of the Super FX and Super Nintendo combination. Sadly, the very aspect that made the game so revolutionary for its time is exactly what would quickly date it in the years to follow and terribly in the decades to follow. On the bright side, a dated game is not, by definition, a bad game, and Star Fox is a shining example of this. It's a largely well-designed and balanced on-rail 3D shooter with a unique 3-way path system that simultaneously acts as a difficulty choice, variety in the obstacles and enemies, generally cool boss fights, and fitting soundtrack. Star Fox isn't the longest lasting title for the console in its wildest dreams, but it's full of explosive space bliss for as long as it lasts. At the very least, this relic from 1993 is worth checking out even in 2016, for it is a significant piece of gaming history as both the debut of one of Nintendo's most beloved franchises and an ambitious technical marvel that pushed the boundaries of the 16-bit era and was ahead of the times. There is no guarantee Star Fox will sit well with you even if you love the genre it stands for, but if you can bring yourself to accept the archaic Super FX graphics and performance, good times are definitely to be had with this first thrilling journey through the Lilat system.